Sure. We'll go ahead and begin. We're going to pick up halfway through Hebrews 10 and run into chapter 11. Um, I don't know a better way to do that, to get into chapter 11. And so we're not going to spend too much time going through, but we'll start in about verse 19, and we'll just run through the last half of the chapter there to get into chapter 11, which has one of the most famous and well-known descriptions of what faith does for the believer. I don't think Hebrews 11 defines faith. Like, it's not telling you what faith is in the sense of here is the dictionary definition, but it tells you one of the things that faith does for people who have that. So we're going to run up to that, hopefully. So it starts in verse 19, talking about the confidence that we have to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus. That's to go into God's presence, is the idea. And so in the tabernacle, you have these holy places, and the only people who were allowed to go there were the priests, and the priests had to be sanctified before they could go in. If you went into these holy places and you had not been cleansed, you would be killed. One example is Nadab and Abihu, who go in and they bring unauthorized fire, whatever that means. I tend to believe that you're referring back to the fire from the altar that God lights. They didn't take coals from that fire. And so they did something that was unholy. They brought something that had not been sanctified into the holy place. And the result is that they are consumed. And that picture of God as a consuming fire is something that will stay with the Hebrew people. And so later in Hebrews, when it says our God is a consuming fire, think of that image of the priests going in, unsanctified, and consumed by fire before the Lord. You'll have the same image later during Korah's rebellion, when people go forward with their censers who should not be offering incense. They too will be consumed by fire, and then the earth swallows up everybody else. So you, however, have confidence to go in the holy place because you're in Christ. No fire is going to consume you. The earth is not going to split open and swallow you. You're safe. Right? You can go in without fear because you have the blood of Jesus that sanctifies you and cleanses you and makes it possible for you to go into God's presence by this new and living way. That's going through the veil, the separation between God and the people. There's no separation now between you and God. Christ has removed that. And so up until the time of Jesus, there's always been this barrier between God and humanity because of uncleanness, because of sin. Well, now all of that's been taken care of. We have that sacrifice once for all that cleanses us, so you can go in. There is not a recurring day of atonement for Christians. Your sins have been atoned for. And I used to think in my mind, very, very similar to the old sacrificial system, that I was clean and unclean and clean and unclean and clean and unclean. But that's not the image. Right? The image for a Christian is that you're always clean. You're always cleansed. And I know that sometimes people will quibble over the wording, or continual cleansing and things like that. Just kind of set that over to the side. We're not arguing about those types of things. It's what the writer in Hebrews says is that you are not clean and dirty, then clean and dirty, then clean and dirty. You are cleansed. Right? You have been made holy so that you can enter into to have fellowship with God through Christ. That's his picture. And so now you're able to do this, and since you're able to do this, right, that's verse 21, since we have this great high priest over the house of God, there are some things that we should be doing. These let us verses. So 22, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Right, that goes back to you being cleansed and sanctified. Like the priests had to purify themselves before they could go into the temple. Well, you have been cleansed because of what Jesus has done, and draw near. Or that draw near is a liturgical phrase from the Old Testament. It comes right out of the Septuagint. It's the word that is used when the priests go into the temple to worship. When they come to offer incense at the altar, when they bring the showbread in, when they bring an animal to sacrifice at the temple, they draw near to the Lord. It's the same word that's used over in Romans chapter 12, where it talks about you offering your spiritual service, your spiritual worship. I think the English Standard Version actually puts the word worship in there. It should. It's the Greek word that is used for worship in the Old Testament. It's a temple word. And so here, that's the idea. Same thing over in James. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Right? The image there is as you come towards God in worship, in your service as a priest, he is not far away from you. He meets you when you come to him. And so here's a very similar idea. We come to the Lord, our response to what God has done should be worship. Now, what does that mean? To draw near in worship. What does that mean for a Christian? How do you do that? Yeah, it's your life of service. Yeah, it's the way that you respond in your life to what has been done for you. Yes. Okay. So the question is, if this is that should increase the Hebrews' faith, that's the point. Look at what God has done. Look at what you should do in response. To increase your faith, how do you do that? My answer would be the same, like, general answer that you're going to get from these "let us" passages. But the question is, what does that look like? One is the broad answer is it's part of this is your life of service, the way that you live, like Romans 12, your living sacrifice. The other part, and the other part is going to come up in just a moment, is the congregating of the Lord's people together. When the Lord's people come together, it's special. If you were part of Israel, right? You were the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the Greek copy of the Old Testament that we're really focusing on because that's what the writer of Hebrews focuses on. Have you ever noticed how in the New Testament the most common phrase or word used to describe Christians? Does anybody know what that is? Close. Just God's people in general, not like me talking to you. Close. We don't use it. Saint. We don't use that word. It is the most common designation for God's people, is the holy ones of God. How often have you ever said, I'm going to congregate with the holy ones of God today? What would people think? That crazy. What is that? Yeah, maybe that. Egotistical. It's like sort of what you think, like angels or spiritual being. That's what you're called. You're called the holy ones of God. The English uses the word saints most often. We tend not to use it because that word gets abused, but it's the most common biblical designation in the Old and New Testament for the people of God. If you're an Israelite, you are always one of God's holy ones. You are a sanctified person. You've been called out from the rest of the world, and you always are, whether it's a Tuesday or a Sabbath. You are always one of God's holy ones. But there are special times when God's holy people convocate. And when they come together, there are special rules and things that God has for them when they come together. And so when you begin looking at our lives, there are two things that happen. There's my life as an individual believer, not totally separated from the rest of my brothers and sisters, but there is my life that I live as a living sacrifice, and there is also this congregating, this time of holy convocation. From the beginning of Christianity up until today, the drawing together of God's people has been something that is important. And it was important because God said it was. Right? It has always been important. Israel had holy convocations constantly. There's just something different about God's people coming together for the purpose of worship. To praise God together. To together. One of the things that I wish we did more often in our culture is talk about how great God is. Just talk about it. in our casual conversation with one another. I mean, you read through the Old Testament and you see that. You read through the New Testament and you see that. Paul begins most of his letters magnifying and lauding and praising God. Right? I should be doing that as an individual in my conversations, but definitely when we come together, because there's something special about that. So those are a couple. Those are like the realms, I guess, and they intersect. Right? I'm still the same person I was. But when we come together, now we can use the term from the Old Testament, a holy convocation, right? A coming together of the Lord's people for a purpose of worship. So how do we live our life? Right? How do you do this? How do you draw near to God? Well, maybe love people. I mean, that's a good start. I think somebody may have said that somewhere. Right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Moses said it first. And then Jesus quotes the law. When he's asked, what are the two greatest commandments? The first is to love the Lord, and the second is to love other people. What does that look like? What does loving your neighbor as yourself look like? Work. Good answer. Well, the illustration of that is the Good Samaritan. And the two people who didn't want to do anything, the priest and the Levite, walk by their brother, and then a Samaritan, who is an outsider, comes and picks the guy up and takes him to an inn and dresses his wounds, and then he leaves money to pay for the man's expenses with sort of like a blank check. If there's anything left over, if there's any bill left over, I'll pay that when I come. And then Jesus turns and asks the question. He really, what he does is he flips the question around. Who was the neighbor? Well, the answer is the one who did all that good stuff. And he says, go and do likewise. That should change the way you live. That short story about that man coming from Jericho, it should change your life. Yes. Yeah. 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 It's not about us. Yes. Yes. Yeah, and it's easy to fall into that way of thinking. Right? If we do what is natural, right? If we just do what our culture is doing, then we will find ourselves in that mode of living, in that mode of thinking. And it won't look like you're a bad person. Right? So we're not talking about being a good person versus a bad person. We're asking the question, what does it mean to live purposefully? What does it mean to live purposefully as a disciple of Jesus? And I like that was your focus. It's work. It takes work to focus on other people. It takes work to love others, to love God first. And when you look at Jesus, that's one of the things, so many of the confrontations, I don't know that I would say most, but so many of the confrontations that Jesus had with the people who were in charge, it was about things that he was doing for others. When he went and ate with the sinners and the tax collectors, they couldn't believe that he would do that. Does he not know who these people are? Yes, he did. Yes. In order to increase your faith, you must be involved and you must be active. Yeah. Yeah, if we contribute. And that's really that's one of the ways that we think about it. Like the picture that you've got is Jesus is the high priest. He's the one who has gone into the holy place. He's offered the sacrifice of atonement. But there were other things that happened at the temple, right? There's daily sacrifices. They would bring showbread in. There's the lighting of lamps. There's all sorts of things that happen at the temple. And so while there's no longer the 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 looming overhang of sin, the reminder of sins every year in that atoning sacrifice, there is still work for the priests to do. The high priest has done his job. He's seated, but we are still going about the image, offering that daily service. We are still worshiping God. We are still doing our job as priests, and that's sort of what we're talking about. And the most faithful people should have been the priests because they should have been the most active people. But I like that description. Yep. Yeah, prayer, praying for people, praying for your enemies, loving your enemies. One of the difficulties with prayer is I like stuff I can measure. I don't know about you. Maybe you don't. I like stuff I can measure. I like things I can quantify. I like things that I can analyze, get a nice set of data and analyze things. Prayer doesn't work that way. Prayer is actually an admission that there are things that I can't do, or there are things that are outside of my control, people who are outside of my control. And when you pray, right, there's different types of prayers. Some prayers are just praying to magnify God. And I don't know if I could tell you, it's going to be this afternoon. I don't know if I could tell you the last time when I just prayed a prayer that was only a prayer of praise, magnifying God and lauding how wonderful He is. There are plenty of Psalms that do that, but I don't always think to do that in my prayer. And sometimes prayer is when you go to God and you ask for things. Well, why do you do that? Mhm. Yeah. And I think that selfishness is why it's hard to pray. I mean, if I'm honest with myself, that's one of the barriers to prayer, is that I want to do, I want to do it. Right? I want to be able to do it by myself. I want to be able to figure it out. I want to be able to understand on my own. And it's like I'm a 3-year-old. Right? Have you ever tried to help a 3-year-old do anything? What they want to do everything by themselves. Right? They don't know how to tie their shoes, but they're going to do it by themselves. Right? And I feel like that sometimes. I don't pray because I just don't want help. And there are times when you pray where that's what you're admitting. I can't do this by myself. Or sometimes it is a weakness of faith because I can't measure it. Right? I was talking to somebody recently that what is real? Like when you think about what is real, if somebody asked you, define reality, what would you say? That would be my answer, right? That's my standard answer. It's very Cartesian, right? Rene Descartes. That was his answer for how he knew he existed. Well, I can see things, I can think through things. It was very tangible, very touchable. And so the idea of reality is we tend to think that only the things that we can touch and see and taste and measure and smell and interact with in some way, those are the things that are real. And so there's a sense in which sometimes you're like, well, I mean, prayer's not real. But it is. Because there are things that are real that you can't see. There are things that are real that you can't touch and measure. Is logic real? Yeah. I mean, there are rules for logic. That's right. That's right. If it's my logic, it's good. But it's not tangible, right? The rules for logic are not tangible. That you can't touch them, you can't measure them. There are these immaterial things that are true, right? Emotions. What we might say that we feel emotions, but how do you measure it? You can't measure it. You might say you're more angry than you were yesterday or more upset, but I mean, is there like a meter? We have a thermometer. I make my children say the word that way, not because they're British, but because I want to emphasize that it is a thermometer. You are measuring heat. Right? That's what we do with stuff. We measure it. How do you measure sadness? The best we can do is like on a scale of 1 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, how sad are you? I don't know. I looked at my meter this morning and it was a 3.8. You can't do it. But it's a real thing. And the same thing is true with others. This is where we all go, yes. Yeah, they're real. Can you measure them? How tall are they? How much do they weigh? We'll ask an ancient medieval question. I guess it's not ancient if it's medieval. How many of them can dance on the head of a pin? I don't know. How do we even measure that? I think the answer was 120,000, by the way. I don't know. Right? But they're real. Is God real? Yeah. Have you ever seen him? Can you measure him? How tall is he? Yeah. And that's where we're headed. Faith is the thing inside of us that allows us to see, to experience the things that you can't measure. Right? It allows you, faith is what allows you to be a partaker in promises that were given long before you were born, and that may be realized fully long after we are dead. I don't know when the consummation of all things will happen. I don't know. Yep. Yes. Right. And that idea, he's coming up in just a minute in chapter 11. But that's sort of where chapter 10 is headed. Is it's running into that question of what is real. And if you only put your trust in the stuff that you can see and measure and quantify in some way, then you're going to live your life in a very different way than if you believe the promises that God has given. And so really, the difference, the struggle that believers have in the world is that you're living in a place that is full of touch, taste, smell, but you're living in this place with a mindset that sees more than that. Right? There are things that you cannot touch and see and taste that are real, things that you can't measure that are real. And that's sort of what we're going through here, is the response to these great things that God has done that you can't see. I've never seen the holy place where Christ has entered into and made the atoning sacrifice. I've never seen it. But do I believe that Jesus really did that? Yes, I did. And people will often ask me, well, why do you believe that? And my response is because the tomb was empty. Yes. And we do that with lots of things. Like we gather information and we look at the evidence and we use our knowledge to go, well, this is probably what happened. Right? Detectives do that. You do that in court cases. If you weren't there to actually see what happened, then you don't truly know. You didn't experience it. So you have to gather evidence and you put it together and you look at it and you say, well, this is most likely what happened. And based off of what we know, this is our conclusion. And that's part of faith also. God has given you evidence. He has given you the things that he has done, the things that he is doing, and the testimony of Scripture. And that is all evidence that believers use to do that very thing, to look at, well, here's sort of what we've got, and based off of this information, this is my conclusion. And when people to get around going through tons of information, when people ask me, why am I a believer? My answer is the empty tomb. The tomb was empty. Everything rests on that. Everything. If you were a Jew in the first century, you wanted to end the Christian thing, all you have to do is find the body. That's it. And how hard is that? That was it. Everything rests on that. The angels, words. Who are you seeking? He's not here. He's risen, just as he said. That is the foundation for everything. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the basis for all of the things that are written in the book of Hebrews. It is the moment, the Apostle Paul says over in Romans chapter 1, it is the moment claimed Jesus to be the Son of God with power. Right? That is it, the resurrection from the dead of Jesus of Nazareth. And so as you're going through this list here, it's not my intention to spend this much time in chapter 10. As you're going through this list, this is the response, the drawing near, worshiping God, holding fast in verse 23, the confession of our hope. Right? You're going to be attacked. And one of the things that you have to do is praise is an appropriate response to God, but also the defense of what is true. Holding fast, not wavering. And what I mean when I say wavering is don't give up. Right? That's sort of the idea. Hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, because he who promised is faithful. Notice whose faith you're depending on. In verse 23, whose faith are you depending on? God's. No, he doesn't say, hold fast the confession of your hope because you're faithful. He doesn't say that. Hold fast to the things that you believe because God is faithful. There are days where I wake up and I do all sorts of dumb things I shouldn't have done. I say things I shouldn't do. I just don't live the way that I ought to live. I'm not blameless. I'm not without sin. I'm not without blemish. But God is, and God chooses to see me that way. We'll talk about that later in the year when we look at Ephesians chapter 5. But he has made atonement for us. So we hold fast to that confession because God is faithful, not because we are. That is our foundation. Not that I'm faithful, God is faithful. And then verse 24, let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good works. So the responses are to worship God because of what he has done, to defend what is true, to hang on to the confession of our hope, and then to help other people do the same thing. To stir one another up to love and good works. That phrase, stir one another up, it can be negative. If I were to tell you that somebody was stirring the pot, what does that mean? Yeah, they're starting up trouble, right? They're causing problems. They're provoking people. It can also be a good thing, because if you're stirring stew or chili or something else that's delicious, right? That's a good thing. And so the idea here is very much like we would say, oh, well, they're causing people to feel certain ways, or they're inciting people to do certain things. They're stirring the pot. That's the idea here. You're supposed to stir the pot in a good way. I wouldn't phrase it that way in our culture today, though, because I think that's only a negative phrase. Have you ever heard anybody stir the pot positively? I don't know that we can do that. Yep. Yeah. Yes. Well, the proverb, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Right? It takes grading action in order for that to work. But some people just grade on you. They don't sharpen. Right? And so it's the same thing. But that's the idea. Is this requires, again, what several people have said, it requires work. It requires effort. And I remember not long after I was converted, I was sitting in a room full of people who were there, and I remember somebody talking about things like this, and I remember thinking, well, why don't they just do it? I mean, if you're supposed to go do good things, if you're supposed to love it, if you're supposed to be kind, if you're supposed to watch what you say, if you're supposed to love other, why don't they just do it? Just do it. It's easy. Nike. What? But it's not always easy, is it? I mean, sometimes you're just in a bad mood. Sometimes you're just low. Right? Sometimes your faith isn't where it ought to be. Sometimes your faith isn't strong. It was a very, very naive, very inexperienced mindset. Well, why don't other people just do it? Well, I've been in places where it's hard to just do it. I've been in places where I didn't want to go listen to the sermon, and I was the one preaching it. Right? I mean, there are times where it is a battle just to get up to go to services on Sunday. That has been a reality in my life before. Why didn't I just do it? Because I'm not always strong. Because I'm not always who I ought to be. I'm not always where I ought to be. And that's when I need people to stir me up. You look at the history of Israel, which we're about to get in chapter 11. How come Abraham didn't always just do it? Why wasn't Abraham always just doing the right thing? Or David? Why did David need Nathan to point out the fact that he shouldn't commit mass murder? Well, because sometimes we just don't see clearly, and we need somebody to stir us up. And so these are the responses that you get. Worship God, defend your faith, hold fast to it, help other people do the same. So there's an outward, an inward, and an outward. That's sort of what you see here. And he's going to say, stir people up in contrast to people who aren't doing anything at all. And that's verse 25. The neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day near. Now, we tend not to see this as, I think, intensely as they would have in the first century. The idea here in the first century is that when you became a Christian, you became part of a family, or a family of people, a community. The Jews were used to this everywhere that they went to live because they had dietary restrictions, they had clothing restrictions, they had all sorts of rules that sort of separated them out. If you were Jewish, you couldn't go to a Gentile butcher because they didn't butcher the animals the right way, they didn't prepare the right meats, they might cut pork on a cutting board, and then they're going to cut something else on it messes everything up. So they would go to their own butchers, they would go to their own tailors, they would go to their own of everything, and it sort of created like a little community. And in the New Testament, like in John chapter 9, where they threaten to throw the people out of the synagogue, what they're saying is not just, you can't come to the church building anymore. I mean, that's true. But it was also, you can't be part of the community. You're not allowed to go to the Jewish butcher. You're not allowed to go to the Jewish tailor. You can't do any of the things in our community. He was kicking them out entirely. And so the idea here is that these people who are neglecting the meeting together, are they not showing up when the Lord's people are coming together for Holy Convocation? That seems to be the case, yes. But it's even more than that. They have kind of removed themselves from the community. They've unplugged entirely. And the emphasis here is, yes, absolutely, on what we do when you have the Holy Convocation, the coming together of the Lord's people. But it's also on the relationship with God's people. You can't unplug. You have to be there, or these things don't happen. And so it includes what we would call worship today, but it also includes the other aspects and other areas of life. You have to have God's people in your life, or we can't do these things. And so that's sort of what you see. And then he's going to get into the next section. If you go on sinning deliberately, that word deliberately is an important word. If you go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries, like Nadab, like Korah, like the fire that comes out from God, like the wall of fire that comes out and separates the Egyptians from the Hebrews. That's the picture, this God who judges with fire. Sodom and Gomorrah, the great picture of a great cataclysm of fire. And again, that word deliberately. If you go back to the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 4 and Leviticus chapter 16, what are all the sin offerings for? The Hebrew writers already talked about it. There's a very particular type of sin. Does anybody recall? Unintentional. Yeah, I heard somebody say it. Unintentional sins. It's for the unintentional sins. Well, one of the things when you read through the law, is actually somebody pointed out to me not long after we moved here. How do you rob someone unintentionally? I mean, we're not talking about it like a bank. You know, if like a banker hands you a pen and you sign the check and you put the pen in your pocket, technically you've robbed them. You robbed a bank. You're a criminal. But what we mean, like, how do you like beat somebody up and steal their lamb and run away with it accidentally? I don't know that you can do that on accident. I stole your car on accident. I broke the window, I hotwired it, I joyrided around. Joyrided? Is that Joy Road? I took your car on accident. Will you buy that? No. You did it on purpose. I don't know how to do things like that on accident. Well, that's one of the things that's listed as something that you can have as an atoning sacrifice for as an unintentional sin. So what does that mean? The idea isn't that you did or didn't do it on purpose at the time. The idea is, do you still mean it? If you stole somebody's lamb, have you repented? Are you sorry? Did you bring it back and did you pay restitution? If you stole somebody's car, were you sorry? Did you bring it back? Have you paid restitution? There's a very different approach to somebody who has done wrong and is penitent versus someone who has done wrong and is persistent. Yeah, I stole your car, and I'd do it again. Are you going to forgive that person? I'm not letting you near my keys, that's for sure. Right? But that seems to be what the law is saying. The sins that are forgiven under the sacrificial systems are the sins that you no longer intend. You may have done it on purpose at the time, like David killing Uriah. That was kind of on purpose. But he didn't mean it later. He repented. And so that's sort of the idea. The Jews who are crucifying Jesus, I don't know how you're in the crowd yelling, crucify him, on accident. Right? That was sort of on purpose. But then those very same people later when Peter preaches, God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus who you crucified. And they're cut to the heart. What must we do? Right? That's not on purpose anymore. They're penitent. And so this idea here of sinning deliberately doesn't mean that you did something on purpose, so now you're in trouble forever. It comes down to your attitude. Are you repentant? Are you penitent? Does sin bring you sorrow, or are you proud of it? Do you do that, to use the phrase from the prophets, are you sinning with a high hand? Is it something that you did in the past and you do it again? And so that's sort of the idea. If you go on like that, after you receive the knowledge of the truth, and the idea here seems to be focused around Jesus. If you know who Jesus is, and you go on acting like he's not the king, he's not the Messiah, then there is no other sacrifice for sins. And the idea there seems to be is twofold. You don't get to go back to the way things were. Right? You can't reject Jesus and just go back to the old system. That's not the path. It only moves forward. And the other thing seems to be there's not another person coming later. You don't get to say, well, we didn't like this Messiah, so we'll wait for the next one. That's not how this works. There's one Messiah, there's one sacrifice, and you have to take it. And so that seems to be the idea here with these people, these Hebrew believers who are struggling. We talked all the different things that they might be facing, all the different temptations and pressures. If they decide that they don't want to follow Jesus anymore, then they can't go back to the temple, and there's not another Messiah coming. And so it's Jesus or nothing. And that's where we'll pick up next time in verse 27 as we go down, verse 26, and run into chapter 11. Thank you very much for your comments and for your time.